The old woman traced her finger across the child's shoulder blade, following the curve of a mark darker than moonlight on water. Outside, dusk gathered in purple folds. Somewhere, a cricket song rose and fell. The grandmother's touch was gentle, deliberate, as if reading a text written in a language older than words. "This one," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "This one has traveled far to be here." The mother watched, her newborn daughter sleeping peacefully, unaware of the speculation her skin had inspired. Throughout the village, similar scenes unfolded. Marks examined by candlelight, elders consulted, stories remembered. For as long as humans have been born wearing these mysterious shadows and stains, we have wondered, what do they mean? Where do they come from? And what secrets, if any, do they hold about the souls they decorate? But before that, comment down below which country you are watching from. In the beginning, there were marks that no one could explain. Long before physicians spoke of melanocytes and vascular formations, before science offered its careful vocabulary, there existed only wonder and interpretation. A child emerged into firelight, bearing a patch of deeper color, a splash of crimson, a shadow that seemed borrowed from elsewhere. The midwives leaned close. The fathers stood at doorways, uncertain. The mothers held their babies tighter, studying these unexpected decorations with eyes that asked questions their lips could not form. The earliest humans must have noticed. How could they not? Birth after birth, generation after generation, children arrived wearing these mysterious badges. Some faded like morning mist, others darkened with age, becoming more pronounced, as if growing bolder in their declarations. They appeared anywhere, faces, backs, limbs, places hidden and places impossible to conceal. No two seemed exactly alike, yet certain patterns emerged, certain shapes that repeated themselves across families, across villages, across centuries. In ancient Egypt, along the Nile, where the sun god Ra watched over everything, people believed that birthmarks carried divine significance. The priests studied them as they studied the stars and the river's flooding patterns, seeking messages from the realm beyond. A mark shaped like a scarab might indicate protection. A stain resembling the sacred ibis could suggest wisdom granted by Thoth himself. Mothers were cautioned during pregnancy to avoid certain sights, certain experiences, lest they imprint their children with unwanted symbols. If a woman witnessed violence, her child might bear the mark of that trauma. If she gazed too long at fire, the baby could emerge with what looked like a burn that never quite healed. The Egyptians were not alone in their interpretation. Across the Mediterranean, in the lands where olive trees twisted toward cloudless skies, the ancient Greeks wove birthmarks into their understanding of lineage and destiny. They told of Seleucus, founder of the Seleucid dynasty, who bore an anchor-shaped mark upon his thigh. This, the stories claimed, was proof of his divine parentage, evidence that Apollo himself had sired him. The anchor became a symbol of his legitimacy, passed down through generations, like a seal of authenticity pressed into flesh rather than wax. His descendants proudly displayed their own anchor marks, proof they carried the blood of gods and heroes in their veins. In Rome, where augurs read the future in bird flights and sheep entrails, birthmarks added another text to be interpreted. A child born with a distinctive mark might be destined for greatness or tragedy, depending on the mark's location and shape. Military families examined their sons for signs of courage. Marks on the chest, perhaps, indicating a warrior's heart. Scholars looked for marks near the head, hoping for indications of intellectual prowess. The Romans, practical even in their mysticism, catalogued and categorized, seeking patterns that might help them predict, prepare, or simply understand. But it was in the vast stretches of Asia that birthmark interpretation became most intricate, most elaborately woven into the fabric of daily belief. In China, where philosophy and folk wisdom intertwined like the characters of their written language, birthmarks were read like maps of fate. The ancient texts spoke of marks as manifestations of karma, visible evidence of the soul's journey through previous lives. A mark on the forehead might indicate exceptional intelligence, or conversely, a tendency toward financial recklessness, depending on which side it appeared. The nose suggested creativity and diligence. The chin marked one as a family's provider, though perhaps cursed with an unpredictable temper. The Chinese developed elaborate systems of interpretation, passed down through generations of fortune tellers and family elders. They observed that certain marks seemed to run in families, reappearing across generations like inherited treasures or curses. A grandmother's mark might resurface on her granddaughter's skin, suggesting bonds that transcended death, connections that persisted despite the veil between worlds. These observations fed the growing belief that birthmarks carried information about past lives, about previous incarnations, and the lessons or wounds they had left behind. In Japan, pregnant women were given careful instructions. "Do not stare into flames," the elders warned, "or your child will be born with burn marks. Do not look upon violence or ugliness. Do not allow yourself to be startled, for if you touch your face in that moment of shock, your child might bear a mark in that exact location." These beliefs reflected a deep conviction that the boundary between mother and child, between the outer world and the inner sanctum of the womb, was permeable, porous, susceptible to influences both visible and invisible. The spiritual traditions of Mongolia offered yet another interpretation. There, where the eternal blue sky stretched endless above the steppes, a particular birthmark became so common it was eventually named for the people themselves. The Mongolian spot, a bluish-grey mark typically appearing on a baby's lower back or buttocks, was seen as a heavenly seal, a kiss from the ancestors carrying the baby's soul to its mother's womb. Far from being cause for concern, these marks were celebrated as evidence of spiritual protection, proof that ancestor spirits watched over the child. This belief in ancestral involvement appeared in variations across multiple Asian cultures. In Korea, the goddess Samsin-Halmoni, protector of childbirth, was said to leave her mark on certain children. In Chinese legends, Songzi Guanyin, the goddess of childbirth, blessed babies with these blue-grey shadows as signs of divine favor. The marks became talismans, visible proof that unseen forces had taken an interest in the child's welfare. India, with its ancient understanding of reincarnation and karma, developed perhaps the most elaborate spiritual framework for understanding birthmarks. Here, the marks were not merely cosmetic accidents, but karmic signatures, evidence of the soul's previous journeys, scars from past lives that the physical body remembered even when the conscious mind forgot. A birthmark might indicate where a fatal wound had been received in a previous incarnation. A cluster of marks could represent multiple lives, multiple deaths, multiple lessons learned or left unlearned. The oral traditions spoke of monks and spiritual teachers who could read a person's karmic history in their birthmarks, discerning past professions, past suffering, past triumphs. A sword-shaped mark suggested a warrior's life. Burn-like stains indicated death by fire. Circular marks resembled bullet wounds, though these interpretations evolved as new forms of violence entered human experience. The fundamental belief remained constant. The body remembers even when memory itself has vanished. In the Middle East, where desert sands held secrets from countless civilizations, birthmarks were linked to lunar mysteries. The Arabs believed that eclipses during pregnancy could mark a child, especially if the mother touched her body while watching the celestial phenomenon. The moon, that ancient governor of cycles and changes, could inscribe its shadow onto developing skin. This belief connected birthmarks to the cosmic order, suggesting they were not random accidents, but rather astronomical signatures, proof that we are all children of the stars and subject to their influence. African traditions, diverse as the continent itself, held their own interpretations. In some cultures, birthmarks indicated divine favor, blessings from ancestors or protective spirits. In others, particularly vibrant marks suggested the child carried special spiritual energy or was protected by a powerful ancestral presence. The marks could identify a child's destiny, healer, leader, storyteller, or simply affirm their place within the great chain of lineage that connected the living with those who had gone before. Native American peoples, spread across two vast continents, developed their own rich traditions surrounding birthmarks. Many tribes saw them as spiritual identifiers, marks left by spirit guides or animal totems. A child born with a distinctive mark might be destined for a special role: shaman, healer, spiritual leader. Some believed the marks were badges of courage from past lives or evidence of the soul's multiple journeys. The Mongolian spots that appeared commonly among Native American infants were seen not as oddities, but as connections to ancient migrations, genetic memories encoded in skin that remembered journeys across frozen straits thousands of years ago. Throughout the Pacific Islands, from the coasts of Polynesia to the scattered atolls of Micronesia, birthmarks were woven into creation stories and genealogies. They helped establish identity, confirmed lineage, connected individuals to their ancestral lands and waters. In cultures where oral tradition preserved history, and where the bonds between past and present remained visibly strong, birthmarks served as another form of documentation, another way of saying, you belong here, you come from this line, these people, this land. What united all these interpretations, despite their vast differences, was the fundamental conviction that birthmarks meant something. They were not accidents, not random occurrences of pigmentation or vascular development. They were messages, signatures, seals, warnings, blessings. They connected the visible world to invisible realms. They linked past to present, ancestors to descendants, cosmic forces to individual human lives. The marks were noticed, interpreted, discussed. Families gathered around newborns, examining their skin by lamplight or sunlight, consulting with elders, comparing the marks to family histories and cultural traditions. Some marks brought relief, signs of protection, indications of good fortune. Others caused concern, suggesting challenges ahead or karmic debts to be paid. But all were taken seriously. All were believed to carry meaning. In marketplaces and temples, In village squares and palace gardens, the old ones would be consulted. They had seen many births, many marks. They remembered the patterns. A woman whose child bore a mark identical to her grandmother's would nod knowingly. The spirit had returned. A father noticing his newborn's mark in the exact location where he himself carried one would feel the weight of destiny, the sense that some things were predetermined, written in flesh before birth. And always, beneath the specific interpretations, beneath the cultural variations and individual family traditions, ran a deeper current of wonder. Why this mark? Why here? Why this child? The questions were universal, asked in every language, whispered in every culture that had ever wondered about the mysteries of birth and identity and the strange ways that bodies announced themselves to the world. The ancient whispers continued, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, from grandfather to father to son. The marks remained mysterious, their origins elusive, their meanings debatable, but never dismissed. In the firelight and the starlight, in the first moments when a child emerged wet and crying into the world, people looked for marks and found meaning, found connection, found another thread in the great tapestry that connected them to something larger than themselves. Some say these old beliefs were merely superstition, attempts to explain what could not be explained, to find pattern in randomness, meaning in accident. But others argue that the beliefs themselves are evidence of something profound, a recognition that we are more than mere biological accidents, that our bodies carry stories, that the boundary between physical and spiritual is thinner than modern thinking suggests. The ancient world looked at birthmarks and saw windows into other realms. They saw proof of reincarnation, evidence of divine attention, marks of destiny. They developed elaborate systems of interpretation, intricate frameworks of meaning. And though the specifics varied wildly from culture to culture, the underlying conviction remained the same. These marks matter. They mean something. They connect us to mysteries we cannot fully comprehend, but which we ignore at our peril. The whispers continue still, softer perhaps in the modern world, but never entirely silent. The belief settled deepest where love ran strongest. Throughout the centuries, across every continent where humans raised children and told stories, one explanation for birthmarks emerged with particular persistence. The mother had done something, seen something, felt something during pregnancy that had imprinted itself onto her child's developing flesh. This theory, known to scholars as maternal impression, became one of the most widespread and enduring interpretations of birthmarks, precisely because it seemed to make intuitive sense. The mother and child were connected, after all. What affected one must surely affect the other. In medieval Europe, where superstition and observation intertwined in ways both practical and fantastical, pregnant women lived under elaborate systems of rules and warnings. The old women of the villages, repositories of generations of accumulated wisdom and worry, would instruct expectant mothers with great solemnity. "Do not look at the moon during an eclipse," they warned, "or your child will be marked. Do not stare at fire. Do not gaze upon deformed or hunchbacked people. Do not allow yourself to be startled by sudden sounds or sights. Do not scratch yourself while craving a particular food, lest the child be born with a mark shaped like that food in the exact location you touched." These warnings were not casual suggestions, but serious dictates, believed to be crucial for protecting the unborn child from unwanted markings. A woman who longed desperately for strawberries but could not obtain them might scratch her arm in frustration, and her child would supposedly be born with a red strawberry mark on their arm. A woman startled by a hare darting across her path might instinctively touch her face, and her baby would bear a mark on their face, or worse, might be born with a cleft lip, forever after known as a hare lip, in recognition of its supposed origin. The logic, such as it was, rested on the belief that the boundary between mother and child remained porous throughout pregnancy, that experiences and emotions could transfer directly, inscribing themselves onto developing flesh. A mother's fear could mark her child. Her cravings could manifest as stains and shadows. Her moments of shock or surprise could leave permanent signatures. The responsibilities was enormous, the potential for blame crushing. If a child was born with a prominent birthmark, the mother might spend years wondering what she had done wrong, what moment of carelessness or weakness had resulted in her child bearing this mark. In Bulgaria, the warnings were explicit and specific. No stealing, the elders said, or touching the face afterward. Otherwise, the child will wear the mark of the stolen item on their face. If a pregnant woman walked past someone with a physical deformity and stared too long, her baby would receive an ugly mark. Even accepting a bite of someone else's apple could result in a birthmark shaped like a bite appearing on the child's face. The catalogue of prohibitions grew elaborate, encompassing seemingly innocent actions, transformed into potential dangers through the lens of maternal impression. In Japan, the belief took particular forms adapted to local circumstances and fears. Women were forbidden from looking at fires or flames during pregnancy. The very act of gazing at fire could cause their children to be born with burn marks, moles, or café au lait spots that resembled ancient scars. If a pregnant woman was startled and touched her face in that moment of surprise, the baby's blood vessels would supposedly gather at the corresponding spot, forming a vascular birthmark like a port wine stain or hemangioma. The body remembered shock, apparently, and inscribed that memory onto the next generation. In China, women who started fires during pregnancy were warned that their children would bear facial birthmarks. The act of creating flame, of summoning that primal element, somehow transferred to the child's skin. This belief reflects the deep connection Chinese culture perceived between action and consequence, between the visible world and the forces that shaped new life. Similar beliefs appeared in the Middle East. Arab tradition held that lunar eclipses were particularly dangerous times for pregnant women. If a woman touched any part of her body while watching an eclipse, that spot would be marked on her child for life. The moon's shadow, passing across the sun or the earth's face, could apparently cast its own shadow onto developing skin, leaving a permanent reminder of that celestial event. In Brazil, Italy, Egypt, and Israel, the legend persisted. If you crave a food during pregnancy and don't satisfy that craving, your child will be born with a mark shaped like that food. The unfulfilled desire literally manifests on the child's body. Strawberries, coffee, chocolate, wine. Each could supposedly leave its signature. Port wine stains from drinking wine, café au lait spots from consuming coffee, bright red marks from eating strawberries. The names themselves reflect these old beliefs, even in medical terminology that supposedly left superstition behind. In the West, well into the 20th century, women were told that consuming too much coffee or chocolate during pregnancy would result in those distinctive brown spots on their baby's skin. The reasoning varied. Sometimes it was the mother's overindulgence that caused the mark, a kind of physical punishment for lack of restraint. Other times, it was simply believed that what the mother consumed frequently would inevitably show up on the child's skin, as if the baby absorbed not just nutrition, but appearance from the mother's diet. The American colonies brought these beliefs from Europe and adapted them to the New World. Native American women had their own traditions, but European settlers carried their fears and explanations with them across the Atlantic. A pregnant woman who walked on plowed ground might mark her child. One who looked at a snake would give birth to a baby with serpentine markings. The frontier was full of potential dangers, both real and imagined, and each one became another item in the growing list of things pregnant women must avoid. By the 19th century, as science began offering alternative explanations, the old beliefs still held powerful sway. Mothers continued to blame themselves for their children's birthmarks, continued to search their memories for the moment of carelessness or bad luck that had resulted in the mark. Medical journals of the era are filled with letters from concerned mothers describing their experiences during pregnancy and asking if these experiences could have caused their children's birthmarks. One physician in 1898 complained about the pestiferous hobgoblin of prenatal impression, frustrated by how persistently the belief endured despite rational explanations. Yet even as doctors insisted that birthmarks had nothing to do with maternal experiences, the mothers themselves often remained unconvinced. They knew what they had felt, what they had seen, what they had feared, and they saw the marks on their children's skin that seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. The belief in maternal impression revealed something profound about how communities understood pregnancy and motherhood. The pregnant woman was seen as supremely vulnerable, her child at risk from countless external influences. She needed protection, guidance, careful monitoring. The elaborate rules and warnings were, in their way, attempts to give women some control over their pregnancies, to provide a framework for understanding and potentially preventing problems. But these beliefs also placed enormous pressure on women, making them responsible not just for their own behavior, but for chance encounters, momentary frights, unavoidable circumstances. A woman could do everything right and still have a child born with a birthmark. Yet the belief system offered no comfort for this, only the suggestion that somewhere, somehow, she must have failed in her vigilance. Some of the advice, viewed from a modern perspective, seems almost tender in its concern. The German folklore that warned pregnant women about craving fruit reflected an understanding that pregnancy brings powerful desires, overwhelming needs. The warning suggested these cravings had power, that they mattered, that they could affect outcomes. In an era before prenatal vitamins and nutritional science, this was perhaps a way of acknowledging that pregnant women needed adequate food, that their bodies' demands deserved to be taken seriously. Other beliefs seem darker, more punishing. The notion that looking at a disabled person could mark your child reflects prejudices about physical difference, fears of contamination or curse. These beliefs revealed the community's anxieties about disability, about bodily imperfection, about the ways that difference was feared and othered, the pregnant woman became the boundary guard, responsible for protecting her child from these perceived threats through careful management of her gaze and attention. Yet even in the harshest beliefs, there was an acknowledgement of the mysterious connection between mother and child, the recognition that pregnancy is not merely a biological process, but something stranger, deeper, more permeable to experience and emotion than simple biology suggests. Modern science has confirmed that maternal stress hormones cross the placenta, that maternal nutrition affects fetal development, that the emotional state of the mother can influence the developing child. The old beliefs got the mechanism wrong, but perhaps they intuited something true about the profound interconnection between mother and child. The theory of maternal impression also reflected limited understanding of causation and correlation. When a woman who had been frightened by a dog during pregnancy gave birth to a child with a birthmark, the two events became linked in memory and explanation. The birthmark needed an explanation, and the fright provided one. Never mind that countless women were frightened by dogs without their children bearing marks, or that children were born with marks whose mothers recalled no corresponding incident. The human mind seeks patterns, creates narratives, finds meaning in coincidence. Throughout history, individual stories reinforced the general belief. A woman would recall being startled by something during pregnancy, would give birth to a marked child, and would tell this story to others as proof that maternal impression was real. These stories accumulated, passed from generation to generation, creating a body of anecdotal evidence that seemed overwhelming even if it lacked scientific validity. The medical community struggled to address these beliefs. Some early doctors, lacking understanding of genetics and embryology, accepted maternal impression as plausible. Others rejected it vehemently, but found their patients unconvinced by their arguments. Women trusted their own experiences, their own mother's wisdom, the accumulated lore of generations of women who had noticed patterns and drawn conclusions. By the early 20th century, doctors were definitively stating that maternal impression was impossible, that birthmarks formed well before birth through processes entirely unrelated to maternal experiences. Yet even as late as the 1920s and 30s, newspapers published concerned letters from mothers asking if their experiences during pregnancy could have marked their children. The belief proved remarkably resistant to scientific refutation. Perhaps this persistence suggests something about the power of these beliefs beyond their literal truth or falsehood. They provided a framework for understanding, a way of making sense of the mysterious and unpredictable aspects of pregnancy and birth. They acknowledged that pregnancy is a time of vulnerability and transformation, when the ordinary rules seem suspended and anything feels possible. They gave communities a shared language for discussing pregnancy, shared rituals and warnings that connected women across generations. The belief in maternal impression also reflects the reality that pregnancy is never entirely predictable or controllable. Despite all the warnings and precautions, children are born with unexpected characteristics, including birthmarks. In an era before modern medicine, before understanding of genetics and embryology, these beliefs at least offered some explanation, some sense that there was a reason, even if the reason placed heavy burdens on women. Today, we know that birthmarks result from genetic factors, developmental processes, the complex choreography of cells and blood vessels, forming a new human being. They have nothing to do with maternal cravings or frights or forbidden gazes. Yet something of the old belief lingers, perhaps, in the way we still think about pregnancy as a time requiring special care and caution, in the way expectant mothers are given endless advice and warnings, in the recognition that what a mother experiences does affect her child, even if not in the ways the old beliefs suggested. The mother's mark, it turns out, is not on the child's skin, but in the mother's heart. The weight of responsibility, the desire to protect, the fear of having somehow failed if anything is less than perfect. That mark, unlike birthmarks themselves, never entirely fades. Some believed the marks were memories written in flesh, in the quiet rooms where spiritual teachers gathered their students, in the temples where incense smoke curled toward ancient ceilings, in the homes of those who held that life was not a single journey, but many. Birthmarks took on a different significance entirely. They were not accidents of biology, not the result of maternal experiences, but rather evidence of something far more profound. The soul's continuity across multiple incarnations, the persistence of experience beyond death, the body's stubborn refusal to forget what the conscious mind could not remember. The belief in reincarnation stretches back thousands of years, woven deeply into the spiritual fabric of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and other Eastern traditions. Where reincarnation was accepted as fundamental truth rather than speculative possibility, birthmarks naturally found their place in this understanding. If the soul survived death to inhabit new bodies, then perhaps it carried markers of its previous journeys, scars from old wounds, reminders of lessons learned, or destinies unfulfilled. In India, where the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth formed the foundation of spiritual understanding, birthmarks were examined with particular attention. The learned ones, those who claimed the ability to read karmic patterns, would study a person's marks, seeking clues about their previous incarnations. A mark on the chest might indicate a warrior who had died from a sword thrust to the heart. Burns or flame-shaped marks suggested death by fire. Circular marks resembled bullet holes, though this interpretation grew more common as firearms became prevalent in human warfare. The location of the mark mattered as much as its shape. A mark on the throat could indicate strangulation or beheading in a former life. Marks on the limbs might suggest amputation or severe injury. Multiple marks could tell stories of multiple lives, each death leaving its signature on the eternal soul. The body, in this understanding, was not merely a temporary vessel, but a kind of canvas on which the soul's entire history could be read by those with eyes trained to see. The philosophy behind this interpretation went deeper than simple cause and effect. Karma, the cosmic principle of action and consequence, operated not just morally, but physically. Violent death, traumatic injury, unresolved suffering. These experiences were thought to imprint themselves on the subtle body, the energetic blueprint that preceded and shaped physical form. When the soul took on a new physical body, these imprints manifested as birthmarks, translating spiritual memory into corporeal reality. But birthmarks didn't only indicate violent death or suffering. Some believed they revealed previous occupations or roles. A sword or dagger-shaped mark might indicate not just death by stabbing, but also a life lived as a warrior or soldier. Port wine stains on the chest were sometimes interpreted as signs that the person had been a military man in a former life, marked by their profession rather than their manner of death. Other shapes might suggest different trades, marks that resemble tools, weapons, or professional symbols. Animal-shaped birthmarks held their own significance in the reincarnation framework. Some spiritual traditions held that souls could incarnate not only as humans, but also as animals, moving through various forms as they progressed along their spiritual path. A birthmark resembling a cat, bird, snake, or fish might indicate a recent animal incarnation, or perhaps a special connection to that animal spirit. These marks were seen as bridges between the human and animal realms, reminders that consciousness takes many forms. The most intriguing aspect of the past life interpretation was the possibility of verification. Unlike purely spiritual explanations that existed beyond proof or disproof, the past life theory made claims that could potentially be investigated. If a child bore marks corresponding to a specific person's injuries, if that child also claimed memories of being that person, then perhaps something remarkable was occurring. In the 1970s and 80s, Dr. Ian Stevenson, a Canadian psychiatrist working at the University of Virginia, devoted decades to investigating exactly these kinds of cases. Stevenson approached the question of reincarnation not from a religious or philosophical perspective, but as a researcher, meticulously documenting cases where children claimed memories of previous lives and bore birthmarks that seemed to correspond to the death wounds of the people they claimed to have been. Stevenson investigated thousands of cases across multiple countries and cultures. He sought cases where objective documentation existed: death certificates, autopsy reports, medical records that could be compared with the birthmarks and memories reported by children. His methodology was rigorous, his documentation extensive. He interviewed families, consulted medical experts, examined birth and death records, always seeking to eliminate alternative explanations and coincidence. In 49 cases, Stevenson and his colleagues were able to obtain post-mortem reports from the alleged previous life. In 43 of these cases, they established what they considered definite correspondence between death wounds and birthmarks, using a stringent criterion. The birthmark and wound had to be within 10 square centimeters of each other at the same anatomical location. The cases Stevenson documented read like fragments of mystery novels. An Indian child recalled the life of a man killed by close-range shotgun blast to the heart. The child bore hypopigmented marks, areas of lighter skin, around the heart region. A Thai man remembered being his own uncle, who had been struck on the head with a heavy knife. The man bore a major skin abnormality on the back of his head, plus a deformed toenail, matching a chronic infection his uncle had suffered before death. A Thai boy had a small round mark on the back of his head and a larger irregular mark on the front, corresponding, his family believed, to entry and exit wounds from a fatal shooting in a previous life. A Burmese girl born without her lower right leg told stories of a previous life as a girl run over by a train. A Turkish boy with congenital facial underdevelopment on the right side claimed memories of a man who died from a point-blank shotgun blast. Stevenson's work was controversial. Skeptics argued that the cases could be explained by coincidence, by the children overhearing adult stories, by unconscious cues from family members who wanted to believe in reincarnation. The correspondence between birthmarks and wounds, critics said, was often approximate rather than exact, and human bodies have limited ways of marking themselves, making some overlap inevitable in any large sample size. Yet Stevenson's supporters pointed to cases where children provided specific, verifiable information about deceased individuals they had no normal way of knowing about. They noted that the birthmark correspondence went beyond vague similarity to include specific details, the shape, size, and location of wounds that would be unusual to appear by chance. They argued that the cross-cultural consistency of the phenomena appearing in Buddhist cultures, Hindu societies, Christian communities suggested something more than cultural conditioning. The debate continued, as such debates do when spiritual belief intersects with scientific investigation. For every case that seemed compelling, skeptics could suggest alternative explanations. For every alternative explanation offered, believers could point to details that seemed to exceed what chance or suggestion could account for. What remained undisputed was that children did bear birthmarks, that some of these marks did resemble wounds, and that some children did claim memories of previous lives with remarkable specificity. Whether these facts proved reincarnation or merely demonstrated the human mind's capacity for pattern finding and narrative creation depended largely on what one brought to the question. Beyond Stevenson's research, the belief in birthmarks as past life indicators continued to thrive in communities where reincarnation was accepted wisdom rather than controversial theory. Tibetan Buddhist teachers would examine children's birthmarks when searching for reincarnated lamas, considering marks as potential clues alongside other signs and portents. In villages across India and Southeast Asia, families would discuss a newborn's marks in the context of deceased relatives, wondering if a grandparent or sibling had returned. The interpretation went beyond mere identification. Birthmarks were thought to carry karmic significance, lessons encoded in flesh. A person might bear the mark of a previous death, not just as identification, but as a reminder, a prompt to live differently this time, to resolve unfinished business, to learn what was not learned before. The mark became a kind of spiritual memo, a note from one's own past selves saying, "Remember, be mindful, do not repeat old mistakes." Some believed that particularly vivid or unusual birthmarks indicated souls who had died traumatically, violently, or prematurely in their previous incarnation. These souls supposedly rushed back into incarnation quickly, before the memories and marks of the previous life had time to fade from the subtle body. The birthmark was evidence of this haste, this incomplete transition between lives. Others held that birthmarks appeared only on relatively young souls, those still early in their cycle of incarnations. More evolved souls, having learned their lessons and achieved greater spiritual development, would incarnate without such obvious markers. The absence of birthmarks, in this interpretation, might indicate a soul that had died peacefully of old age in its previous life, or one that had progressed beyond the need to carry such visible reminders. Animal-shaped birthmarks particularly fascinated those who believed in transmigration of souls across species. A child with a birthmark resembling a bird might have recently incarnated from avian form, or might share a special connection with bird spirits. The mark indicated kinship with the animal kingdom, a reminder that consciousness flows through many vessels and that the boundaries between species are less firm than they appear. Sacred geometry patterns, stars, circles, triangles, spirals, appearing as birthmarks, were sometimes interpreted as evidence of angelic or highly evolved souls choosing human incarnation. These marks suggested not past suffering, but spiritual nobility, souls on special missions, or carrying particular gifts. A Star of David-shaped mark, a perfect circle, a triangle. These were seen as seals of spiritual authority, badges of wisdom earned across many lifetimes. The shapes themselves became a kind of language, a vocabulary of soul history written in skin. Long, thin marks suggested blade wounds. Rough, irregular patches indicated burns. Circular depressions could be bullet holes or ancient arrow wounds. The interpreters learned to read this language, to distinguish between marks that indicated warrior lives and those suggesting healer incarnations, between violent deaths and peaceful passings, between first lives and 100th lives. Yet even among believers, there was acknowledgement that not every birthmark carried past life significance. Some marks might indeed be merely biological, random variations in skin development. The challenge lay in discernment, in developing the sensitivity to distinguish meaningful marks from ordinary ones. This discernment supposedly came through spiritual training, meditation, or simply long experience observing patterns. The belief in birthmarks as past life evidence offered something that other interpretations did not. It gave personal history a scope beyond a single lifetime. Your mark was not just something you were born with, but something you had earned, carried over from previous adventures of your eternal soul. This made birthmarks less accidental, more meaningful, woven into the grand narrative of spiritual evolution. For those bearing prominent or unusual birthmarks, this interpretation could transform shame or self-consciousness into pride or at least acceptance. The mark was not a flaw, but a badge of experience, proof that you had lived before, would live again, were part of a journey vast beyond imagining. Some found comfort in this, found meaning that eased the burden of difference. The past life interpretation also connected birthmarks to destiny and purpose. If your mark indicated a warrior's death in a previous life, perhaps this life called you to pursue peace, to learn gentleness, to balance your soul's accumulated experience. If burn marks suggested death by fire, perhaps water would be your element now, your healing, your path. The mark became a compass, pointing toward lessons and directions, helping orient a life toward its proper course. Critics might say all of this is projection, the human need for meaning creating elaborate mythologies to explain random variations. Believers might respond that the very consistency of these beliefs across cultures and centuries suggests something more than fantasy, that perhaps the soul does indeed remember what the mind forgets, and the body keeps the score. The marks remain, whatever their origin. And for those who look at their own marks, or their children's marks, and wonder about previous lives, about souls that travel through time wearing different bodies but carrying the same essential self, the question persists: what stories are written in this flesh? What journeys has this soul already taken? And what do these marks mean for the life that lies ahead? The echoes continue, faint but persistent, whispering of lives lived long ago. But there were darker interpretations, born of fear. In the shadowed centuries when witch hunters prowled through villages and accusations could end in fire, birthmarks took on a sinister significance that had nothing to do with divine favor or past life memories. They became evidence of evil, proof of corruption, signatures left by demonic forces on human flesh. The very marks that some cultures celebrated as angel kisses or ancestral blessings became, in other times and places, cause for terror and persecution. The belief emerged most forcefully in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, that fevered time when witch panic spread like contagion across the continent and into the American colonies. In an era already saturated with fear, plague, famine, religious upheaval, social instability, the search for scapegoats intensified, and birthmarks, those mysterious variations in skin that appeared without explanation, became convenient evidence for those seeking to identify servants of Satan. The logic, if it could be called that, ran thus. When a witch made her pact with the devil, he marked her. These marks, birthmarks, moles, scars, any unusual skin variation, were supposedly placed by Satan himself, proof of the contract between witch and demon. They were called witches' marks or devil's marks, and their presence on a person's body could be sufficient evidence for accusation, trial, and execution. In 1647, an Englishman named Matthew Hopkins published his guide for identifying witches, titled The Discovery of Witches. Hopkins, who styled himself Witchfinder General, provided detailed instructions for finding these supposed devil's marks. Any unusual mark on the body, birthmarks, moles, warts, scars, could be considered suspect. Hopkins and his fellow witch hunters would examine accused women thoroughly, searching every inch of their bodies for these telltale signs. The examination itself was invasive, humiliating, traumatic. Women were stripped naked, their bodies scrutinized by strangers seeking evidence of supernatural evil. Any mark that seemed unusual, any spot that appeared different from surrounding skin, could be seized upon as proof. In some cases, accused witches were pricked with needles at the sight of these marks. If the spot did not bleed or the woman did not cry out in pain, this was considered further evidence that the mark was supernatural in origin. The cruel absurdity of this logic is obvious now. Nerve-damaged skin, natural variations in sensitivity, the body's stress response to trauma, all could result in reduced sensation or bleeding at particular spots. But in the grip of witch panic, rational explanation gave way to fear and superstition. Hopkins' methods led to the executions of hundreds of people in England and the American colonies, many condemned, at least in part, because of birthmarks they had carried since infancy. The witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, between 1692 and 1693, brought this deadly interpretation of birthmarks to the New World. During the Salem Panic, any physical peculiarity could become evidence of witchcraft. Moles were called marks of Satan. Women were examined for suspicious marks, and the discovery of such marks contributed to accusations and convictions. The paranoia was such that even the absence of marks could be interpreted as evidence. Clearly, people said, the devil had been clever enough to mark his servant invisibly. The neck birthmark of Anne Boleyn, wife of King Henry VIII, provides a historical example of how birthmarks could be used against women in power. In 16th century England, Anne's birthmark on her neck was pointed to by her enemies as evidence that she was a witch, one of several accusations used to justify her execution. Whether those making the accusations truly believed the birthmark indicated witchcraft or simply used it as convenient ammunition against a woman who had fallen from favor, the result was the same. The mark became a weapon. The association between birthmarks and evil extended beyond witch trials. In various European traditions, certain birthmarks were thought to indicate that a mother had done something wicked during pregnancy, or that evil forces had influenced the child in the womb. A prominently marked child might face suspicion and ostracism, their marks read as evidence of corruption or curse. Families might hide children with noticeable birthmarks, fearing how neighbors would interpret the marks. This darker interpretation created a climate of fear around birthmarks that persisted long after the witch trials ended. Even into the 20th century, folklore retained echoes of these beliefs. Parents of children with prominent birthmarks might feel shame or worry, concerned about how others would perceive their child. The old association between unusual marks and evil, though no longer leading to execution, nevertheless cast a shadow over what might otherwise have been seen as harmless variations. The witch trial interpretation of birthmarks reveals the dangers of seeking supernatural explanations for natural phenomena, particularly when those explanations serve the purposes of power and control. The witch hunters claimed to be identifying evil, but their methods created evil, turning ordinary human variation into evidence for capital crimes. The same marks that in other cultures indicated blessing or protection became, in the hands of witch hunters, justification for torture and murder. Yet even in these dark times, not everyone accepted the witch hunter's interpretation. Some physicians and philosophers argued against the notion of devil's marks, pointing out that birthmarks appeared on people of evident virtue as well as on accused witches. Some clergy questioned whether God would allow Satan such obvious physical manifestations of his influence. Rational voices existed, though they were often drowned out by the roar of panic and persecution. The gradual decline of witch hunts in the 18th century brought some relief, but the association between birthmarks and evil did not entirely disappear. Folk beliefs continued to carry traces of the old fears. Certain types of birthmarks, particularly dark or unusual ones, might still provoke superstitious dread. Parents might seek to have marks removed or concealed, not for medical reasons, but because of lingering unease about what such marks might signify. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church offers an interesting counterpoint to the European witch trial interpretation. In this tradition, birthmarks, particularly those appearing on the forehead, were seen not as devil's marks, but as kisses from the Virgin Mary, blessed touches from the Mother of Christ. The same physical phenomena that prompted execution in one culture were celebrated as holy in another, demonstrating how profoundly cultural context shapes interpretation. Religious traditions beyond Christianity also had to contend with birthmarks and their meanings. In some Islamic communities, birthmarks were examined for their potential significance, though interpretations varied widely. Some saw them as marks of divine will, evidence that Allah had particular plans for the marked individual. Others viewed prominent marks with suspicion, wondering if they indicated some spiritual failing or curse. The contrast between interpretations, angel's kiss versus devil's mark, blessing versus curse, evidence of reincarnation versus proof of witchcraft, illustrates how the same physical reality can generate wildly different meanings, depending on cultural, religious, and historical context. A birthmark is just a birthmark, a variation in skin pigmentation or vascular structure. But humans, being meaning-making creatures, have projected onto these marks every variety of significance, from the most benevolent to the most malevolent. For those who lived through the witch trial era, bearing prominent birthmarks, the experience must have been terrifying. To carry on your body what others interpreted as Satan's signature, to know that this mark you were born with could be used as evidence to condemn you. This must have created a particular kind of dread. Some people, we know, attempted to remove or disguise their marks, using various methods to lighten, conceal, or eliminate what they feared others would interpret as evidence of evil. The psychological impact of these beliefs extended beyond those directly accused or examined. Communities living under the shadow of witch hunts learned to be suspicious of difference, to view unusual physical characteristics with fear rather than acceptance. This created a culture of conformity and concealment, where standing out in any way could be dangerous. Birthmarks, along with other physical variations, became liabilities rather than neutral characteristics. Children growing up in such environments learned early to hide their marks if possible, to deflect attention, to minimize their difference. Mothers of marked children might live in constant low-level anxiety, watching their children and wondering if someday an accusation would come. The marks that other cultures saw as connections to ancestors or evidence of past lives became sources of vulnerability and fear. The end of the witch trial era did not immediately erase these associations. Cultural memories are long, and the connection between birthmarks and evil persisted in attenuated form through folk beliefs and superstitions. Even people who did not consciously believe in witchcraft might feel uneasy about prominent birthmarks, carrying forward an inherited discomfort whose origins they no longer remembered. In some communities, rituals developed for cleansing or neutralizing birthmarks, attempts to remove whatever taint or curse the marks supposedly carried. Mothers might lick their newborns' birthmarks, believing this could make them disappear. Prayers might be said over marked children. Folk remedies might be applied, attempting to fade or eliminate the marks. These practices reflected lingering anxiety about birthmark significance, even when explicit belief in devil's marks had faded. The story of birthmarks as devil's signatures is a reminder of how belief systems can transform neutral phenomena into matters of life and death. The marks themselves never changed. They were always simply variations in how skin developed, accidents of biology with no inherent meaning. But the meanings humans assigned to them had profound, sometimes fatal consequences. It's also a story about power and its abuses. The witch hunters who claimed to identify devil's marks were often men examining women's bodies, using religious authority to justify invasive scrutiny and violence. The interpretation of birthmarks as evil provided convenient justification for persecution that served political and social purposes, having nothing to do with genuine belief in witchcraft. Today, we look back on the witch trials with horror, recognizing them as cautionary tales about mass hysteria, gender violence, and the dangers of superstition. The birthmarks that were once read as devil's signatures are now understood as harmless variations, occasionally requiring medical attention but carrying no moral or spiritual significance. Medical science has replaced supernatural interpretation, at least in most contexts. Yet something of the old unease perhaps lingers. People with prominent birthmarks sometimes still feel self-conscious, still wonder what others think, still face questions and stares. The specific belief that birthmarks indicate evil has faded, but discomfort with difference, with visible variation from the norm, persists in subtler forms. The shadow cast by those dark centuries, when birthmarks could condemn, has not entirely lifted. For all the horror of this interpretation, it serves as a reminder that beliefs matter, that the stories we tell about bodies and difference have real consequences. The supposedly spiritual concerns can mask very earthly agendas of power and control. The same marks that one culture celebrates, another condemns. The meanings we assign to physical characteristics reflect not the characteristics themselves, but the fears, values, and power structures of our societies. The devil's signature was never on anyone's skin. It was perhaps in the hearts of those who would use superstition as justification for cruelty, who would transform natural variation into evidence of evil, who would condemn the innocent based on marks they were born with and could not change. The true marks of evil were left not on the accused, but by the accusers, in the historical record of persecution that used birthmarks as its excuse. The darkness has receded, but the memory remains, a reminder to be wary of those who claim to read evil in human flesh, who use physical difference as evidence of moral failing, who transform ordinary variation into justification for harm. Yet some marks carried privilege rather than persecution. In the gilded halls where kings held court and dynasties rose and fell, birthmarks took on yet another meaning entirely. Here, far from the witch hunter's scrutiny and the spiritual teacher's contemplation, certain marks were interpreted not as curses or karmic signatures, but as proof of noble blood, evidence of divine right to rule, visible confirmation of legitimacy and lineage. The same variations in skin that condemned some elevated others, transforming accident of birth into badges of authority. The belief in royal birthmarks persisted across cultures and centuries, finding particular prominence in Russia during the 17th through 19th centuries. In the Russian court, it was widely believed that members of the royal family bore distinctive birthmarks that set them apart from common people. These marks supposedly indicated divine favor, proof that the Romanov dynasty ruled by God's will rather than mere human ambition. The birthmarks became part of the mystique of royalty, another way in which royal bodies were understood to be fundamentally different from ordinary bodies. The logic behind this belief connected to broader ideas about noble blood and the hereditary right. If royal families were genuinely set apart by divine will or superior lineage, then surely this distinction must manifest physically somehow. Birthmarks provided visible evidence, marks on the flesh that could be pointed to as proof of nobility. When a child of royal blood was born bearing a distinctive mark, this was celebrated as confirmation of their legitimate place in the succession. These beliefs were not unique to Russia. The ancient Greeks told stories of Seleucus, founder of the Seleucid dynasty, who supposedly bore an anchor-shaped birthmark on his thigh. This mark was presented as proof of his divine parentage, evidence that he was the son of Apollo rather than a mortal father. The anchor symbol became associated with his dynasty, with his descendants supposedly inheriting the same distinctive mark. Early Christians later adopted the anchor as a religious symbol, creating a continuity between ancient myth and emerging faith. The hereditary aspect of these beliefs was crucial. If royal birthmarks were passed down through families, appearing on generation after generation of nobles, then they served as a kind of biological authentication, harder to forge than seals or signatures. A pretender to the throne might claim royal blood, but could they show the family birthmark? The marks became part of succession disputes and legitimacy questions, their presence or absence potentially affecting the course of history. In some cultures, specific birthmarks on specific body parts indicated not just royalty in general, but particular dynasties or lineages. A mark on the shoulder might indicate one royal line, while a mark on the back suggested another. The location, shape, and color of the mark all carried significance, creating an elaborate system of bodily heraldry that paralleled the coats of arms and symbols that noble families displayed on shields and banners. Folklore developed around these royal marks, stories of princesses whose suitors had to guess the location of their birthmarks to win their hands in marriage. These tales emphasized the intimate knowledge that came with true love or legitimate succession, suggesting that only the right person would know where to find the hidden mark that proved royal identity. The birthmark became a test, a challenge, a secret that separated legitimate claimants from imposters. The Chinese imperial system developed its own interpretations of birthmarks and their significance. Here, marks were examined not just for proof of nobility, but for indications of the mandate of heaven, the cosmic approval required for legitimate rule. An emperor born with particularly auspicious marks might be seen as especially favored by the heavens. Marks in certain locations, particularly the face or forehead, were read as signs of intelligence and wisdom, qualities necessary for effective rule. The connection between birthmarks and rulership appeared in African traditions as well. In some kingdoms, particular birthmarks were associated with royal lineages or spiritual authority. A child born with specific marks might be designated as heir apparent or selected for training as a spiritual leader. The marks indicated not just blood relation, but spiritual calling, connecting political authority with religious significance in cultures where the two were understood as inseparable. Native American tribal leadership sometimes incorporated birthmark interpretation into succession practices. While most tribes did not have hereditary monarchy in the European sense, spiritual leaders and chiefs were sometimes selected based on signs and omens, including birthmarks. A child born with particular marks might be raised specifically for leadership roles, their marks interpreted as evidence that the spirits had chosen them for special responsibility. The interpretation of birthmarks as indicators of royalty or spiritual nobility created a stark contrast with the witch trial interpretation. The same physical phenomena that could condemn a poor woman as a witch might elevate a noble child as evidence of divine favor. This disparity reveals how profoundly class and power shape the meanings assigned to bodies. A mark on a peasant's skin was suspect, possibly demonic. The same mark on royal skin was sacred, divinely ordained. This difference was not lost on people living through these times. Folk tales and ballads sometimes played with these contradictions, telling stories of low-born children with royal marks or nobles revealed as commoners when their marks were examined. These stories expressed both fascination with and skepticism toward the idea the skin could carry such definitive information about status and worth. In India, where both reincarnation beliefs and caste systems operated, birthmarks could be interpreted as indicating not just past lives, but also spiritual status and caste identity. Particularly auspicious marks might suggest a soul of high spiritual development, while other marks might indicate lower status or karmic debts to be paid. The braided relationship between spiritual belief and social hierarchy meant birthmarks could reinforce existing power structures while also occasionally challenging them. The modern era has largely abandoned the belief that birthmarks indicate royal blood or divine right to rule. Genetic testing, photographic documentation, and democratic values have all combined to eliminate birthmarks as evidence of legitimate succession. Yet echoes of these beliefs persist in popular culture and imagination. Stories of hidden princesses identified by birthmarks remain popular in fairy tales and romance novels. The idea that bodies carry secrets about identity and destiny continues to fascinate. Contemporary spiritual communities have, in some cases, revived modified versions of the royal birthmark belief. Some practitioners of New Age spirituality speak of soul marks or spiritual birthmarks, marks that supposedly indicate old souls, spiritually advanced beings, or individuals with special missions. These interpretations blend past life beliefs with ideas about spiritual nobility, creating a modern version of the ancient conviction that some marks indicate special status. The psychological appeal of the royal birthmark interpretation is understandable. To believe that your birthmark indicates noble blood or spiritual superiority is far more comfortable than believing it indicates evil or past life trauma. The royal interpretation offered dignity and significance, transforming what might otherwise be seen as a flaw into a badge of honor. For people bearing prominent birthmarks, this interpretation provided a positive framework for understanding their difference. However, this interpretation also reinforced problematic ideas about hierarchy and inherent superiority. The belief that certain people are born to rule, that nobility is inscribed in flesh rather than earned through character and action, justified systems of inherited privilege and unearned authority. The birthmarks that supposedly proved royal blood were accidents of biology, given meaning by social systems that benefited from maintaining clear distinctions between nobles and commoners. In cultures where royalty intermarried extensively to maintain bloodlines, certain birthmarks might indeed appear more frequently in royal families due to shared genetics. This could seem to confirm the belief that royal marks ran in royal blood, though it was simply heredity operating as heredity does, with no supernatural or divine involvement. The observation was accurate. The interpretation was mythology. The decline of absolute monarchy and the rise of democratic governance gradually eroded belief in royal birthmarks as indicators of legitimate rule. When political power derived from votes rather than bloodlines, when leadership was understood as earned rather than inherited, the significance of royal marks diminished. They became historical curiosities, interesting footnotes in the biographies of past rulers rather than live political questions. Yet the longing for visible signs of specialness, for marks that indicate destiny or nobility, has not entirely faded. People still examine their birthmarks, wondering if they mean something, if they indicate some special quality or calling. The specific belief in royal blood has faded, but the broader hope that our marks mean we are somehow chosen, special, different in a positive way, that hope persists. In some contemporary contexts, birthmarks are celebrated as marks of individuality, unique identifying features that make each person distinct. This modern interpretation values difference without claiming superiority, appreciating birthmarks as part of human diversity rather than evidence of hierarchical status. It's a democratic version of the royal birthmark belief, suggesting that everyone's marks are significant precisely because everyone is significant. The history of royal birthmark interpretation serves as a reminder that the meanings we assign to physical characteristics are cultural constructions, not inherent truths. The same mark that indicated royalty in one context meant nothing special in another, or even indicated evil in a third. The mark itself never changed, only the stories people told about it varied. For modern people who carry birthmarks, this history offers liberation. Your mark does not indicate royal blood or divine right. Neither does it indicate evil or curse. It is simply part of your body, a variation in how your skin developed, as natural and meaningless and meaningful as the color of your eyes or the shape of your hands. You are free to assign it whatever significance you choose, or none at all. The marks of supposed royalty have faded into history, taking with them the belief systems that elevated certain births over others based on skin variations. What remains are simply marks, simply people, simply the endless human capacity to find meaning and create stories, to look at our own flesh and wonder what it says about who we are and where we belong in the great tapestry of human existence. And so, we arrive where we began, in the realm of wonder. The sun sets differently now than it did in ancient Egypt or medieval Europe, yet children are still born, bearing marks their parents cannot explain. Doctors offer their careful vocabulary, hemangiomas, cafe au lait spots, Mongolian spots, port wine stains, cataloguing and categorizing with the precision that modern medicine demands. They speak of melanocytes and blood vessels, of genetic factors and developmental processes. They can describe how birthmarks form, even if they cannot always explain why this child, this mark, this particular configuration of cells and color. But the scientific explanations, thorough as they are, do not erase the wonder. A mother still traces her finger across her newborn skin, following the curve of a mark that seems, somehow, significant. A father still wonders if the mark that appears on his son's shoulder, in the same place where his own father carried a similar mark, means something beyond genetics. The old questions persist, quieter perhaps, but never entirely silent. What does this mean? Where did it come from? And why? Modern parents, armed with medical knowledge and assured that most birthmarks are harmless, still find themselves consulting the internet at 3 a.m, searching for meaning beyond what the pediatrician offered. They discover the old beliefs, the past life theories, the cultural interpretations, the folklore that spans continents and centuries. Some dismiss these as superstition, smiling at the quaint notions of ancestors who lacked scientific understanding. Others find themselves unexpectedly moved, recognizing in these old beliefs something that resonates, some acknowledgement that birthmarks feel meaningful, even when we know they shouldn't. The tension between knowing and feeling, between scientific explanation and intuitive significance characterizes the modern relationship with birthmarks. We know they are simply variations in skin development. We know the mechanisms behind their formation. Yet knowing does not always diminish wondering. A birthmark shaped like a heart still makes people smile, still feels like a sign of something, even if that something cannot be precisely articulated. A mark that appears in multiple generations still creates a sense of connection, of family continuity made visible in flesh. Contemporary spiritual communities have found new ways to interpret birthmarks, blending ancient beliefs with modern frameworks. Some speak of birthmarks as soul contracts, visible reminders of lessons chosen before incarnation. Others describe them as energy signatures, places where spiritual experiences have left their mark on physical form. These interpretations use modern language, energy, consciousness, intention, but echo very old convictions that birthmarks carry meaning beyond their physical manifestation. The research into reincarnation and birthmarks, pioneered by Dr. Ian Stevenson and continued by others, remains controversial but fascinating. The cases documented in academic papers and books continue to provoke questions, even among skeptics. How do we explain children who bear birthmarks corresponding to wounds of deceased individuals and who also provide detailed, verifiable information about those individuals' lives? Coincidence, suggestion, and fraud can explain some cases, but do they explain all? The debate continues, as unresolved now as when Stevenson began his research decades ago. Meanwhile, people continue to be born with birthmarks, continue to wonder about them, continue to find or create meaning around them. In social media groups and online forums, parents share photos of their children's birthmarks, asking if anyone knows what they mean. Others respond with stories from their own cultures, their own families, their own experiences. The collective human need to interpret, to find pattern and significance, expresses itself in these modern spaces, much as it did in ancient villages and medieval courts. Some contemporary perspectives celebrate birthmarks as marks of beauty and distinction. Models and celebrities with prominent birthmarks have helped shift cultural attitudes, presenting their marks as assets rather than flaws. This represents a significant change from eras when birthmarks were hidden, removed if possible, or viewed with suspicion. The modern embrace of diversity and individual difference has created space for birthmarks to be seen simply as part of human variation, interesting and sometimes beautiful rather than problematic. Yet even in this more accepting climate, people with birthmarks still sometimes face questions, stares, and assumptions. Children still get teased about their marks. Adults still field comments from strangers. The visibility of difference, even when that difference is benign, still marks people as subjects of curiosity. This social dimension of birthmarks, the ways they affect how we are seen and how we see ourselves, persists regardless of whatever spiritual or cultural meanings we assign or dismiss. The medical community has developed increasingly sophisticated treatments for birthmarks that cause medical issues or significant cosmetic concern. Laser treatments can fade vascular birthmarks. Surgical removal is sometimes possible for problematic marks. These interventions offer genuine help for people whose birthmarks cause physical discomfort or psychological distress. Yet they also raise questions about acceptance and difference, about when intervention is truly necessary, and when it reflects cultural discomfort with variation. Some people choose to keep birthmarks that could be removed, finding them meaningful or simply part of their identity. Others pursue treatment, feeling freed by the removal of marks that made them self-conscious. Both choices are valid, reflecting individual relationships with embodiment and difference. The availability of treatment has, paradoxically, made keeping a birthmark more clearly a choice, adding another layer to how we understand and relate to these marks. In cultures where old beliefs still hold sway, traditional interpretations persist alongside modern medical understanding. A Chinese grandmother might take her grandchild to a pediatrician for medical evaluation, while also consulting traditional texts about the mark's significance. An Indian family might pursue laser treatment, while also noting the birthmark's karmic implications. The old and new coexist, sometimes comfortably, sometimes in tension, as people navigate between different ways of knowing and believing. The question of what birthmarks mean ultimately cannot be answered definitively because it is not, at its core, a question about objective truth. It is a question about meaning-making, about how humans understand their bodies and their lives, about the frameworks, scientific, spiritual, cultural, through which we interpret our physical experience. A birthmark can simultaneously be a collection of melanocytes and a karmic reminder, a vascular malformation and an angel's kiss, a genetic inheritance and a past life wound. Which interpretation feels true depends on what we bring to the question. For some, the scientific explanation is sufficient and satisfying. The mark is explained by biology, and that explanation provides all the meaning necessary, or reveals that no special meaning exists beyond biological process. For others, scientific explanation, while accepted as accurate in its own terms, feels incomplete. It describes mechanism but not significance, how but not why. These individuals may embrace both scientific understanding and spiritual interpretation, holding them together without requiring that they be reconciled. The persistence of belief in birthmarks' spiritual or cultural significance, despite scientific explanations, reveals something important about human nature. We are meaning-making creatures. We find or create significance even where it might not objectively exist. This is not a flaw, but perhaps a feature, the capacity that enables art, spirituality, culture, all the layers of meaning we wrap around our biological existence. Children born today with birthmarks will grow up in a world that offers them multiple frameworks for understanding their marks. They will hear scientific explanations from doctors, cultural interpretations from relatives, spiritual possibilities from various traditions, and personal narratives from others bearing similar marks. From this plurality of meanings, they will construct their own understanding, their own relationship with the marks they carry. Some will see their marks as essentially meaningless, biological variations requiring no interpretation beyond medical classification. Others will find deep significance, whether through spiritual beliefs, family stories, or personal revelation. Most will probably fall somewhere in between, acknowledging the medical reality while remaining open to the possibility that their marks might mean something more, or at least that they are free to assign meaning if they choose. The mystery, ultimately, is not whether birthmarks truly carry karmic significance or divine messages or ancestral signatures. The mystery is why we need them too, why we cannot quite accept that these marks are simply marks. Why we continue to search for meaning in our skin? Perhaps the answer lies in the fundamental human experience of embodiment. The strange fact of being consciousness housed in flesh, of having a physical form that shapes our experience even as we transcend pure physicality. Birthmarks, visible from birth, unchanging markers on changing bodies, seem to invite interpretation. They appear without our choosing, mark us as individuals, sometimes connect us to family lines, occasionally create bonds with strangers who share similar marks. They are intimate yet visible, permanent yet harmless, significant and insignificant simultaneously. They embody paradox, and humans, being creatures who live in paradox, mortal yet dreaming of immortality, individual yet longing for connection, physical yet craving transcendence, recognize something in birthmarks that speaks to our condition. The old beliefs have not disappeared because they serve functions beyond explanation. They create narratives of connection to past lives, to ancestors, to cosmic forces, to divine attention. They transform the random into the meaningful, the arbitrary into the significant. They suggest that we are seen, marked, known by forces beyond ourselves. For beings who often feel lost in an indifferent universe, these suggestions carry comfort and meaning that scientific explanation, however accurate, cannot provide. Yet there is also deep value in the scientific perspective, in understanding that birthmarks are simply variations, not marks of evil or proof of superiority. This understanding has freed people from persecution and from the pressure to see their marks as evidence of spiritual status. It has enabled effective treatment for problematic birthmarks. It has reduced shame and fear. The loss of enchantment that comes with scientific explanation is balanced by the gain of liberation from harmful superstitions. Perhaps the wisest approach is to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to appreciate the medical understanding of what birthmarks are, while remaining open to the possibility that they might mean something more, or at least that we are free to find meaning in them if we choose, to smile at the old stories while recognizing the human needs they addressed, to neither dismiss all spiritual interpretation as superstition nor accept all traditional beliefs as literal truth. The marks remain, constant across changing interpretations. The baby born tonight in Singapore carries similar marks to babies born millennia ago in ancient Egypt, yet the meanings assigned to those marks have transformed completely across time and space. The marks do not change. We do. Our beliefs evolve. Our cultures shift. Our frameworks for understanding transform. The birthmarks simply continue, appearing on each new generation, inviting or resisting interpretation depending on what we bring to them. And so the mystery persists, not despite our knowledge, but alongside it, enriching rather than contradicting scientific understanding. We know what birthmarks are. We know how they form. We know they carry no inherent meaning beyond what meaning is given to them. Yet we continue to wonder, to interpret, to find significance. This too is part of being human. The capacity to know something is meaningless, yet choose to find meaning anyway. To understand something scientifically, yet approach it with wonder. The old woman still traces her finger across the child's shoulder, following the curve of a mark darker than moonlight on water. But now she smiles, not with certainty about divine signs or past lives or ancestral kisses, but with the simple pleasure of connection, of touch, of wonder at the mystery of new life however it arrives and whatever marks it brings. The twilight gathers, as it always has. The stories continue, changing and remaining the same. And the marks, the beautiful, mysterious, meaningless, meaningful marks, carry on appearing, one birth at a time, inviting us still to wonder what they mean, even as we understand that perhaps the wondering itself is the meaning, the question more important than any answer. The mystery breathes in the space between knowing and believing, between science and spirituality, between explanation and wonder. It lives in the grandmother's touch and the mother's gaze, in the quiet moment when someone looks at their own mark and asks the eternal question, what does this mean? The universe, being vast and perhaps indifferent, offers no answer. But we, being human and incapable of leaving mysteries alone, continue to provide our own answers, our own stories, our own meanings. And in that endless process of interpretation and wonder, perhaps we find something true. Not about birthmarks necessarily, but about ourselves and our need to find significance, connection, meaning in the marks we bear.